today from unceded land on which the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the guardians of the lands and waters. Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, has historically been known as a meeting place and a location for exchanges between many different nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe. You're joining us today, I'm sure, from many different territories as well, and I invite you, if you're interested, to share in the chat the land on which you find yourselves. We can share our stories and learn one from another. While you're sharing the lands on which you find yourself today in the chat, I would take this opportunity to speak to the Stony Kettle First Nation that's produced this incredible work of art that we're sharing with you today.
So for today's session, I will start by introducing the Spirit Change program and the objectives of the SMO Impact Journey series. I will briefly contextualize today's session theme on localization by sharing key highlights from a collaborative study on localization that we participated in. I will then introduce our three fantastic speakers and invite them to share their journey. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, which will give us 20 to 25 minutes for a discussion at the end. Feel free to ask your question in the chat along the way, and we will keep them for the end. So for those who are joining a Spirit Change event for the first time, let me introduce briefly who we are. So the Spirit Change program is a 5-year initiative of the Intercouncil Network, the ICN, and it's funded by Global Affairs Canada. It aims to increase the effectiveness of Canadian small and medium-sized organizations. So Spirit Change offers learning opportunity, knowledge sharing opportunities for SMO, but it also aims to increase the engagement of Canadian, particularly youth, as global citizens. So we offer opportunities for youth via our Youth Champion program, but also for educators, so they could share resource among their educators community on global citizenship education. So Spirit Change is part of the broader SMOs for Impact and Innovation initiative, which includes the FIT program and Development Impact Window. So we've launched this series to celebrate SMOs' successes and share their learning. This 5 years SMO initiative has been an important commitment from Global Affairs Canada to support SMOs, and it had significant impact in Canada, but most importantly, around the world in communities where SMOs work. So over the next few months, and until the end of the Spirit Change program in March 2024, we will convene the Canadian Global Development Community to join us and hear from SMOs and their partners. They will share their successes and challenges throughout their impact journey and the important work they have accomplished with their partners over the past 5 years with the support of the SMO initiative. It will also showcase how small investments could lead to incredible social and political changes. So today we have invited you to hear from 3 fantastic speakers who've all been supported via either FIT, Development Impact Window, or Spirit Change. They will share their impact journey through the lens of localization and the importance of building equitable relationship amongst partners. Small and medium-sized organizations offer a unique perspective on localization and community-led approaches, as they are known for their commitment to local partners with very long-term relationships built over decades. So before introducing our speakers, and to provide a little bit of contextual background, I will briefly share some key findings from a study we did in collaboration with a research team. Donc, en 2020, avec une équipe de recherche...
In 2020, with a research team drawn from several different universities, we launched a collaborative study funded by SSHRC in order to better understand the impact the pandemic has had on Canadian NGOs and especially on small and medium organizations, SMOs. One of the dimensions of that study was looking at the pandemic's impact on localization practices within Canadian SMOs. You remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a presumption that The pandemic could accelerate localization processes. Our goal with this study was to compare the experiences of large, medium, and small organizations to try and understand the ways in which the pandemic transformed or didn't their practices related to localization. Over the course of this study, which was run from 2021 to 2023, we had interviews with 22 organizations and surveyed 104 organizations. And given that there is no universal definition for this idea of localization, we wanted to better understand what Canadian organizations understood by the idea of localization, how this was translated into their practices. We asked them the two following questions. What is your organization's approach to localization? And what is your organization attempting to accomplish through localization? After having analyzed the respondents in an iterative manner, we identified 16 terms or sentences that Canadian NGOs use to describe approaches to localization. Very quickly, we determined that these approaches weren't all equivalent. We therefore chose to classify them depending on whether they're meeting the purpose of transformation. It's listed here as transformational localization, and those who that really focus on transforming local power relationships. We would have local decision making, shared decision making, and decolonization approaches. And these are approaches that center partners within the organization's initiatives. The other end of the spectrum, there were certain initiatives or approaches that didn't necessarily um, weren't necessarily part of a transformational approach, but they were more basic approach to localization that didn't really focus on transferring power towards local partners. Between these two, we identified a few practices that were a bit more ambiguous that could serve to transform power relations or not, depending on how they're implemented. Again, according to the Canadian organizations that participated in our study, the two most commonly named approaches are those in gray, enabling or empowering. And the second was capacity building. And third was locally led development. And these are the localization approaches that were most often named by respondents when we asked them what approaches they're putting in place. As you can see, there are a large number of organizations, especially with the orange columns, that aren't necessarily seeking to fundamentally transform relationships of power between the organizations and their partners. Some of them limit their localization approaches to increasing local capacity or consulting local partners, and so without necessarily transferring any decision-making power to those organizations. For others, as you can see in the blue columns, they're taking much more transformational approaches, favoring local autonomy, local decision-making, etc. We also wanted to know if participants had changed their practices, their understanding of localization over the course of the pandemic. Our survey allowed us to monitor the changes to the organization's activities both before and after the pandemic. In these activities, there were um, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, implementation of programs, the design of programs, fundraising, donor relations, and reporting. And so we asked the following question to organizations. Which activities are your partner organizations more involved in since the beginning of the pandemic? As you can see, the most commonly named answers were related to program implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and in program design. And then when we asked them what activities their partner organizations were less involved in, we see activities that bear more transformational power, including fundraising, donor relations, and also decision making, which isn't indicated here, but decision making related to budgets. And those are the activities that had the least change over the course of the pandemic. So, in order to summarize our key findings of our study, is that there wasn't a broad acceleration of localization across the sector. Acceleration in certain practices were only seen when organizations already had a certain momentum, which means that organizations that weren't already actively engaged in transforming power relations between partners didn't necessarily use the pandemic to undertake that work. On the contrary, the changes that we're seeing were rather limited and more in practices that we considered basic or limited. Having said that, we can retain, as my last slide, the four following elements. First, that's important to distinguish between different approaches and types of localization practices, those that have a more transformational potential and those who maintain a status quo. And this allows organizations to take a more in-depth approach to considering how they use localization practices and how to transfer power to local partners. We also noticed in the study that organizations that are involved in coalitions, in networks, in working groups tended to better understand the fundamental issues with localization, were better able to identify the types of approach in use within their organizations. Third, organizations operate within a policy and regulatory context, which naturally is structured by funders. Even if it is the responsibility of organizations to take action on localization, we still need to recognize that their efforts can be limited by institutional and structural constraints. And fourth, organizations that have undertaken these processes and committed to transforming their practices did in fact accelerate the transfer of power during the pandemic. It's never too late to undertake these types of efforts and to transform organizations. If you'd like to know more about the study and especially the ways in which the pandemic impacted organizations depending on their size, which I didn't have a chance to get into today, it will be published in the coming months.
Okay, so it is now my pleasure to introduce our three speakers for today's session. All three have inspiring stories to share on how they built equitable partnerships and work toward shifting power structure. Our first speaker, Talent Jumo, is the executive director of the Harare-based organization Katswe Sisterhood. Talent is a passionate feminist activist from Zimbabwe. Our organization is working with the Toronto-based International Council of AIDS Service Organization, HICAZO, to implement a SRHR project in Zimbabwe called Simba Kano, Health is Power. This project is supported by Global Affairs Canada through the Development Impact window. If you are interested in reading Talent's full bio, I invite you to read the speaker overview document prepared by my colleague John and share with you all yesterday. Talent will be followed by Catherine Liao. Catherine is a research associate at the Center for Justice, Equity, and Sustainable Action within the University of the Fraser Valley. And she is also a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. Through a FIT-funded project, Catherine has been partnering with Albinism Royal Foundation to test an innovation which aimed at economically and socially empowering persons with albinism, particularly women and girls in Sierra Leone. And our third speaker, Liliana Coys-Loisel, is a proud member of the Métis Nation of Alberta who works at VIDEA, an international development organization based in Victoria. Liliana will share about VIDEA's decolonization journey as an organization and the impact this journey has had in the communities where they work, their relationship with partners, and in the ways they work as a team. VIDEA has been supported by the Spirit Change program for over 3 years. So Talent, the floor is yours. Oh, you are muted. Yes, there you go.
That's fine. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very grateful that I could find this opportunity to speak to you all about this important topic. I've just taken over the share button and I'm trying to project my presentation today. So once again, my name is Talent Jumo. I'm based in Harare, Zimbabwe. And today I'll be sharing my reflections on localization and decolonizing aid. And my sub-theme is who will hold the donors to account. And I'm grateful for this opportunity because it's an important opportunity to try and highlight first our experiences with what we think works, and then secondly, general reflections around recommendations on how we can improve on how we partner with organizations in Africa. At this point, I'm trying to move my slides with not much success. So I might request colleagues to assist me.
Yeah, for sure, Talent. I'll jump in.
Thank you.
Would you
So
mind
I'll
just...
share?
Yeah, perfect.
Sure. Thank you.
No problem. Just one moment here.
Thank you very much. So I will basically share reflections from the partnership that we had with ICASO, which is a Canadian-based organization under the SMO window. And here in Zimbabwe, we partnered another youth organization, Youth Engage. And my reflections are centered around what I think worked. And then, as I said earlier, I'll also then go into recommendations. Can we move on to the next slide? So on this slide, this is just a summary. We implemented a 4-year project in 4 districts, reached 7,600 girls. And our area of focus was sexual and reproductive health and rights, getting young people mobilized to find their agency and create some demand for services, while also activating the supply side. So we had a 4-tier initiative where, apart from just getting the young people mobilized, we also worked to strengthen the capacity of health service providers to provide youth-friendly services. And beyond that, engaged government around policy reviews that would work in the favor of young people who wish to access extra services in a very restricted setting where some of that is actually not readily available. And the principles that guided our work, and which is really relevant for our conversation today, is that this, for us, we saw it as a twinning exercise. Unlike the traditional donor funding partner, implementing partner relations, we felt that we could engage with ICASO on an almost equal basis. There was a lot of opportunities for co-creation, from the conceptualization of the initiatives themselves to presenting a project proposal. We felt that there was a high level of transparency. We have been in partnerships where everything is done in Europe or in a developed country, and then we just get a template which we then adapt for our own use. But in this instance, our partnership was centered around equity, around capacity strengthening, and we could influence what we thought worked and propose what we thought worked, as well as influence how we could implement that. And as I said earlier, this initiative was supported by Global Affairs Canada. Next slide, please. So the twinning, once again, CASO and Youth Engage have an understanding of the context. So as we talk about localization, it's important because local organizations have an understanding of the context, of the language, the culture, and what vision, in our case, young people have for the future. It is easy to come up with templates that will impose and say SRHR advocacy is what works. But you come to Zimbabwe where, apart from just talking SRHR, you need to be able to ensure that the environment is fertile, that communities are engaged, that the primary issues that young people are facing of unemployment, economic, the poverty, those issues also need in a way to be addressed. And so having local organizations who have an understanding of the context will enable us to design effective programs. We may not necessarily be able to respond to everything, but it is important that when we work with communities, there's an understanding that we are listening to their actual felt needs and bringing in layers that can then help alleviate the challenges. The reflections, more reflections from Simbao-Tano. I think our partnership, as I said earlier, helped demystify the donor implementing partner relations, and addressed power imbalances. There was a lot of co-creation from, developing the proposal, the performance measurement frameworks, baseline surveys, gender analysis, the reporting, and including the monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes. We engaged in a lot of collective reflection processes, and to us, this was an accompaniment. And I would like to already say, we believe that when you talk localization, we are not necessarily just saying local organizations can do it on their own, because the space remains competitive. Local organizations continue to have capacity gaps, and relations such as this offer an opportunity for hand-holding and accompaniment, which is what local organizations require to be able to deliver with efficiency. Next slide, please. So I just highlight there the 4-cycle Pachoto methodology that we implemented as a collaborative initiative under the Simbao-Tano initiative, and the 4 stages being assessments that we did collectively, and then we went into a whole awareness raising campaign using participatory methods, theater and arts, and then we had a very strong advocacy initiative, and there were actions that were related to that. So you encounter a young person in your awareness exercise and outreach mission, and they have an issue that needs redress. The action level is where we then linked them to the appropriate service. Next slide, please. So I've shared briefly about our experience with Simbao-Tano, where we felt there was a lot of hand-holding and accompaniments. And now that our grant cycle has ended, we feel like we've been plunged back into the fold, into the woods, where we have to be faced with, the traditional funding models. And we hope that there will be more hand-holding moving into the future. So what I want to say is the experience with Simbao-Tano was useful because there were opportunities for capacity strengthening. However, we still feel that we are not yet there. Yet, if we are then to be faced with the traditional funding models, you realize that we almost feel like we're in the woods and we cannot compete. It's not a level playing field, because just talking localization without facilitating spaces for capacity strengthening, accompaniment, and support for local organizations means we now have to compete with much bigger organizations. In a context where there's increasing donor demands, thematic shifts, tighter competition, we're having to compete with international organizations that are localizing, seeing that the debate is now moving towards, oh, let's support local organizations. You realize that some international organizations now we have surnames, right? So it's international this, that, Zimbabwe. And it becomes a challenge for little Katsuke to compete with this organization that has a whole business development office located somewhere in Europe. And then we have Katsuke that's also trying to make space, but we have bigger entities that are localizing just to be able to still access the millions. So I say in my first point, millions for the big fish. And then for local organizations, it's just little resources, yet we are expected to deliver. Donor-grantee relations in such a scenario can be intimidating and exploitative, because we are basically going into a maze. We have to interface with partners online, and we have to use a language that is foreign to us. And in this case, we may not have the representation that we have had. So the playing field is not level, because smaller organizations can only bid for tiny, grants, yet we still need to work long hours in order to be able to be regarded as delivering with efficiency. And one point I would also raise is that what then that does to us is we're then forced, in order for us to try and compete with bigger entities, we are forced into consortiums, right? And I've highlighted there that most of them are like forced marriages, because in many cases, for you to have a fighting chance, you have to partner, the bigger organizations. And sometimes the proposal you input, you share methodologies and strategies of what you think works, but you actually never see the text. And when the resources arrive, you don't know how that is being divided. When you implement, you produce reports, sometimes you don't even get sight of the final report. So it's almost like we do the work, but we continue to be written out of the story. And I have an image on the side there, and it depicts how we feel sometimes, that as local activists, we are constantly having to fight for funding, for recognition. We have ideas, but we end up floating. And we can't even recognize ourselves anymore because we are being plunged into this maze where we have to be fighting because there's no language, there's no focus. And I think the appeal here is to say, can we have methodologies on localization that still enable capacity strengthening? Next slide. Yes, so for me, the traditional funding model is oppressive in a way. And on this slide, I'm talking about shifting power back to the people. A locally driven agenda would be consultative and inclusive. And when we do the work, attribution, we are helped to amplify our voice, and the attribution should come back to us so that we can also grow these organizations that we work so hard for. It takes a proper approach, grant making that is proper and gendered and responsive to the real felt needs of our organizations. A grant making process that nurtures movement building rather than promote silos and deepen the cracks. So far, the way we have experienced the traditional funding models really just divides us. What we need in order to attain some level of transformative change is for social movements at home here to work together. But because of the current design, we are constantly in a competitive mode, and there's very limited time to really engage in collective reflection, co-create, and just work together in a manner that is nurturing and supportive and complementary, because we are constantly having to fight. And if we're not careful in how we approach this localization agenda, it tools to empower those who have always been privileged and disempower those of us who are more grassroots based, who may not have the that level of capacity. So by all means, we need a process that is nurturing, as opposed to top-down approaches that just promote silos and division among organizations. Grant-making processes that help strengthen our institutional mechanism and also take care of the welfare of activists. One that says donors are partners, are our development partners. They are not sacred and can actually be challenged and held to account. One that says that in as much as we are all excited about the digital space, not all organizations we have access to a computer or the internet, or we have access to the language. And if all we do is evaluate proposals based on how well put it has. Some people will use ChatGPT, others we have business development offices, I said earlier on, located in developed countries. They have $200,000, just for fundraising. I need a $20,000 grant, and I can't compete with that big organization. So an empowering relationship is one that says, we understand where you are, and we want to nurture you, because local movements are what are going to transform our systems locally. Next slide, please. And yes, the privilege matrix, we are CBOs, we require institutional strengthening. We cannot compete with, institutions that enjoy racial privilege. We have organizations that are white-led, and we know that they will access funding over a dinner, you know, and for some of us, you need to be able to present a well-written proposal that's if it's even looked at. You can't secure an appointment just like that. And if you're talking localization, we need to be genuine and honest and be able to really understand privilege, because as it is, you know, being a Black woman working with young people locally, it's even tough. And more we continue to see introduction of, you know, sub themes for mainstreaming. So recently, we have one of our program officers who is visually impaired, and we were asked to attend a donor partner meeting. And I said, we have a colleague who is visually impaired and we think he's best suited to attend this process, but he needs accompaniment. And we got a negative response. They said, sorry, but we only have a slot for one person. But I'm looking at all this demand, you know, from revised funding proposal templates that ask you to say, how are you going to mainstream disability? And now we have an office. I was sitting here, but the funding mechanism does not accommodate for me to be able to facilitate participation by this particular individual. So it feels like the demand is on us to be responsive, you know, to subpopulations who have been marginalized. But on the other end, you don't have the requisite support to facilitate that participation or an enabling environment that enables us to mainstream effectively. And another point to make is that local activists are burnt out, yet we have the role to play, especially in the transformative work. So I talked about the international organizations that we see are localizing currently because it's more strategic, because of the strategic direction the donor community is taking. Yet you will not see them in parliament because they don't have a mandate to advocate for policy change, you know, they're not regarded as local organizations. So most of our development work, if our focus is going to be just financing the bigger entities because they have the perfect systems and, you know, their finance management systems are top notch, we're going to see a lot of welfareism because that's what they're good at, humanitarian work, and we thank them for that. But it leads to a whole depoliticization of the agenda, because when you go and march against a political leader for any violation, they are not able to do that because they are seen as foreign entities. So if you're looking for transformative, a transformative agenda and supporting that, we need to look at local organizations. Next slide, please. So funding for liberation, education for liberation. Yeah, Paulo Freire says education is meant either to liberate or to domesticate. So we need to self-introspect as we talk localization. Are we looking to domesticate local organizations, or we want to fund in ways that are liberating? So multi-year grants are more enabling, because we cannot have a revolution, you know, that runs from January to December. And that's what we are seeing more and more, very short-term funding, very restricted. Yet in movement building, there'll be new ideas, and we need to engage communities, and they will share their reflections, and we need to be able to build on that. So a liberating kind of program design is one that is unrestricted, one that looks at institutional strengthening and not just little projects that enable, you know, people to feel good without, you know, necessarily being transformative. So localization is primarily about listening. And in listening, what it means is the course of action will not be static, and therefore unrestricted funding, emergency funding, COVID taught us, all that becomes very important. We need to build local capacity. The funding community needs to look at this in a way that shows they really want us to be liberated, to take charge, to find our agency. Fund us like you want us to win. Next slide. So I close there with an image of myself and colleagues. You know, those are young leaders in Zimbabwe. In a three-day process, they created what they thought, you know, was the vision that they wanted. You know, they want to launch campaigns, and it's, you know, the images that you see them holding, they are the ones who originated that. And it would require a partner who listens, who will say, I have my funding template, but this is what young people are saying works, and this is the visual, this is the image. I'm going to fund that in a way that these young people dictate, as opposed to, oh, my rigid template is according to me and the science that I subscribe to. This is what works. So I wanted to end with a happy picture that says young people in Zimbabwe are still dreaming about a positive future, and we require an enabling, supportive grant-making mechanism that would then help lift the dream from the image that you see into the community, making it a reality. That requires listening, that requires trusting that the young people can take charge and they know what is required and they can actually do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talent, for this amazing presentation. You raised so many crucial elements. And as many shared in the chat, you shared the reality that many organizations are facing on the ground. So thank you so much. If you have questions for Talent, I invite you to either write them in the chat or keep them for the end of the presentation, at the end of the tree presentation, so you can raise your hand and share the question verbally. We will now turn to Catherine's presentation. So Catherine, do you want to share your screen? Wonderful.
Great, I think everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. First of all, thank you, Talent. I think your presentation really resonated with me. I really like that sort of liberation, funding for liberation. I think, hopefully all of us in this space can now advocate for funding for liberation. So thank you for that reflection. Thank you, Spur Change, for the invitation to share my learnings on shifting power, localization, and action. I will begin with an overview of our FIT funded project to give you some context. I will then share some insights on how we at UFE operationalize some aspects of localization, and I must sort of put it in disclaimer at the individual level. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral land of the Stola peoples here in Chilliwack, BC. So the University of Fraser Valley in BC and Albinism Royal Foundation, Sierra Leone, were recipients of the Funds for Innovation and Transformation grant from 2021 to 2022. Our project was titled Leaving No One Behind, Empowering Persons with Albinism, particularly women and girls, in rural regions of Sierra Leone. As you can see on the slide, our team consisted of Dr. Gitanjali Gill, Alicia Tonier, and myself at UFE. And Albinism Royal Foundation's team comprised of Sarah Nagaiva, Bernard Nagaiva, founders of Albinism Royal Foundation, the 12 gender champions from the 11 districts where we worked, and Ibrahim, the driver, who drove us all from one end of Sierra Leone to another, often through villages with no tarmac roads. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide just to give you more context about this partnership. So I was a VSO volunteer working as a nurse educator at the university in the Northern District of Sierra Leone in 2011 to 2013. And Bernard, as you can see in the second picture, was the first person I met at the airport as the VSO staff. Bernard's job was to ensure that all volunteers were dropped off at their respective locations after a 2-week intense in-country orientation in the capital city of Freetown. I spent 2 years in Sierra Leone, and I built relationship with Bernard, Sarah, and the various communities where I served. And for the past decade, I have remained closely connected to Sierra Leone through my work with Research Africa. And so Sarah and Bernard founded Albinism Royal Foundation in 2018 because Sarah, as a person living with albinism, had experienced marginalization, stigmatization, violence, and rejection from her family, the community, and policymakers. She wanted to create a different future for the children with albinism. And many persons with albinism in Sierra Leone live in abject poverty due to a lack of employment and livelihoods because of their neglected health and educational needs. Many lack voice and agency. And women in particular with albinism suffer intersecting forms of oppression based on their gender, disability, class, and color of their skin. Persons with albinism exist almost invisibly in the society in Sierra Leone. ARF is a grassroots organization and functioned without an operating budget. Sarah and Bernard raised funds to carry out their activities through personal money or donations from friends, families, and church members. And to put it into context, ARF had approximately $700 to run their activities. One day, Gitanjali, my co-lead in this project, and I met for coffee, and she brought to my attention about the FIT program, and we should apply, and if I had known anybody in my sort of area of work. And immediately I thought about Sarah and Bernard, Albinism Royal Foundation, and the rest is history. This is Albinism Royal Foundation's first funded project. So Albinism Royal Foundation conducted a gender-based analysis plus with support from UFE before we even submitted the concept note and proposal. They identified that persons with albinism, particularly women and adolescent girls who are empowered, can be effective advocates for their needs and rights, as well as for the greater gender equality in Sierra Leone, with support, obviously, from the men and boys with albinism, parents with children living with albinism, and various stakeholders that work in gender, disability, education, lawmakers, policymakers, and even community advocacy groups. The FIT-funded project focused on skills training and income-generating activities such as sewing, tailoring, and weaving, a sector dominated by men in Sierra Leone. We focus on financial literacy and marketing by collaborating with Green Giraffe, a fair trade Canadian-owned company in Sierra Leone. We provided training opportunities for leadership and advocacy in communities across the 11 districts using digital storytelling, skits, public speaking, and group discussions. We did all of this in 15 months. Total participants was 100, and we had 35 trainers and 12 gender champions. Sarah and her team traveled across 11 districts, organizing gender equality workshops, conducting baseline, midline, and endline activities, and bringing persons with albinism together to share their stories. Parents spoke about the discrimination their children experience in school, and some openly shared their experiences of gender-based violence. Now, these sharing circles empowered persons with albinism to change the narrative and to challenge the misconception that persons with albinism don't die, they disappear. Now, the most significant impact this project has had is creating visibility for persons with albinism across Sierra Leone. They were united in making their voices heard. More importantly, this project gave Sarah's community hope. Many of our project members spoke about how they too can do all things that humans do. Sometimes when we dehumanize people, it's easier to discriminate against them. The project created a collective movement. Persons with albinism can realize their rights and advocate for a more equitable future. So the impact of this project is because of Sarah, Bernard, and their team, which brings us to the topic of localization. In my opinion, I think we have theorized the concept of localization to the extent that we think it is a naturally occurring phenomena. But we all know that localization in action is a struggle created by systems and structures in place that do not necessarily support localization. And I think this meme sums it up quite well. And I'm going to maybe illustrate an example that Sarah shared with me recently. So Albinism Royal Foundation, they were successful in their grant application with the Canadian Funds for Local Initiative, managed by the Canadian Embassy in Accra, Ghana. And this is the first grant that ARF has applied independently. ARF received the decision letter in July with project activities to commence in August, and their first report is due in November. Sarah and Bernard received the first disbursement last week after multiple exchanges of email. There were delays because the grant award team sent $100 as a test, despite Sarah and Bernard telling them that we had no issues when UFE sent us big chunks of money from Canada. And another organization in Sierra Leone that is managed by a Canadian NGO were also successful in this Canadian Local Fund for Initiative. And Sarah informs me that this organization had received the first disbursement as scheduled. So I'm going to let you leave this example for you to read in between the lines. Now, localization does not happen in a vacuum. It requires attention to these elements. And localization is almost synonymous with decolonizing, anti-racism, and co-creating knowledge. It takes time to build trust, And the concept of localization directs us as organization in the global north to take the lead from our partners in the global south. Now, I have come across, like many of you, the Charter for Change that outlines the 8 fundamental tenets of localization: direct funding, partnership, transparency, recruitment, advocacy, equality, support, and promotion. And I think some of these terms are quite abstract in my opinion, and there is this assumption that it happens in a vacuum, with little attention to the historical, sociopolitical, cultural, contextual, economical context, as Talent was mentioning in her presentation. So to truly practice localization, the expectation is to shift power. But the reality is, can we truly shift power? Or is it better to think about redistributing power? Because shifting power will require structural and system level changes. I'm going to give you some time to read this quote. It's from this book called Reimagining Civil Society Collaboration and Development, Starting from the South, a book that my partner Gitanjali recommended. It is free to download and you can even purchase a copy. So I'm going to leave you a few seconds to read this quote. So how did UFE operationalize localization? So as co-leads on the project, Gitanjali and I are critical scholars and practitioners. We are attentive to power imbalance and our positionality, and thus we practice critical self-reflexivity as much as possible. We are committed to decolonizing global development, and like many in this space, we want to advance social justice and promote human rights for all, the commitment to leave no one behind. We acknowledge that development work is nonlinear, and we cannot reduce human or social phenomena to numbers. So our data collection reflected this stance. I often find the term beneficiary to be quite dehumanizing. It takes away the agency of the individual, the opposite of what we are trying to promote. We deprofessionalize how we worked with Albinism Royal Foundation, and many of us in this space have used WhatsApp and other non-formal communication tools with our local partners. And I have often paused and questioned our approaches. Are we being professional? But again, who dictates what is professional and what is not? I did not have an 8 to 4 Monday to Friday relationship with Sarah and Bernard, which again reflects the point of the importance of building personal relations in partnership. Sarah and Bernard are great leaders. Their on-the-ground perspective and engagement meant everyone in the community knew about the project and what was required of them and us, speaking to the sort of downward accountability. I often feel that we were more of an aid chain. We took the lead from Sarah and Bernard. We used a very hands-off approach and played the role of a facilitator, guiding ARF to fulfill programmatic requirement as outlined by FIT. And to this day, Bernard still teases me about the PMFs, and he mocks us saying, no gender equality, no program. So many of us have used intersectionality analysis to guide our work, but it is essential to move beyond the rhetoric of multiple identities intersecting. I encourage myself to use intersectionality as a critical social theory to facilitate social change. And now you might wonder, why am I not listing concrete examples of how we operationalize localization? To be honest, there is no cookbook approach to doing localization. From my experience, these are just aspirational tenets that we built on our work, and the rest just evolved with time. But one concrete example that I can give to demonstrate localization in action is to partner with grassroots organization. Partnering with grassroots organization creates a ripple effect, as you can see from this slide. Sarah, a very amazing leader, has gone above and beyond this project lifecycle. Sarah has appeared on television and radio station, changing the narrative of persons living with albinism. She has presented internationally with us at the Gender and Women's Studies Conference in Thailand. She was invited to speak at a conference in Ghana, and she's part of the UNDP Working Group for Persons with Disability. Grassroots organization can be a force of change, and often they have the lived and living experience of the challenges that we are trying to address collectively. As I said earlier, localization cannot happen in a vacuum. Systems and structures will also need to change. And most importantly, localization starts in our own backyard. Funding agency must support small, medium organizations through programs such as FIT, Spur Change programs, and the Development Impact Program. Because many of these SMOs, ourselves included, work very closely with grassroots organizations. And this is where localization in action happens, by redistributing power. So my take-home message is no one size fits all. We need to interrogate our positionality and move away from the narrative of false generosity. And most importantly, build relationships is the starting point. So I left you a very sort of imperfect picture just to show you, perfection is sort of a concept that we all have, created in our own heads. Working with grassroots organizations, for me, is the way forward. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It was amazing to learn about your partnership and the work that collectively you've been achieving. So this is and thanks for all the great sharing around, like, questioning, like the theoretical vision that we have on localization versus our capacity to actually implement in the system that we have. That was fantastic. And I'm sure there will be some questions for you at the end. Now let's turn to Lily. So Lily, do you want to share your screen? And please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And yeah, Talent and Catherine, you made such beautiful slides. And I was just going to do some storytelling and then last minute put some photos together, which John is generously sharing for me. But I just want to thank you both first, Talent and Catherine, for sharing. Both of what you've talked about have really resonated with me. I just wanted to snap my fingers, Talent, when you're talking about a lot of the barriers within the systems that we work within. And I was really touched by your story, Catherine, of Sarah and Bernard. So thank you. And I'm really honored to be with you all today. I know it was an introduction earlier, but my name is Lily, and I am coming to you here from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta, which is where I am from and living currently. And yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the organization I work for, Videa, our decolonization journey and the impact it's had on our work and on the communities that we work with. It's been a really transformational few years, and I'm excited to talk about it. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about my own journey and some of the work that we've done in partnership with the Spur Change program. So I work at Videa as head of culture, stories, and reconciliation. And I first got involved at Videa as a IAYI intern. So I was doing an internship in Uganda, and then I started, while I was there, the Spur Change Youth Champion program in its first cohort. And since then, we've had 7 other youth from our Videa community who have been a part of this program. And honestly, the work that we've been able to do with the Spur Change has been a big part of our localization and decolonization journey. It's allowed for a lot more solidarity building and relationship building between youth here in Canada and youth in Zambia and Uganda, where we have our awesome partner organizations. And myself, I got to work very closely with Bertha, who's a close friend of mine now in Zambia, and we did a lot of public engagement activities and storytelling hour at Videa, which was really cool. And yeah, so the community engagement work I got to do there was a big reason as well that I stayed more connected with Videa as well, and built a lot more connections in the middle of a pandemic, and now working for them today. So yeah, very grateful for the Spur Change program. These are a couple of pictures here from the Spur Change conference in Montreal in 2022, where me and some colleagues facilitated a decolonization 101 workshop, which was really fun. Just a couple pictures from there, and I'm going to transition now to talking about what that journey has looked like for us and why it's so important and what our approach has kind of looked like. And I'm going to look more broadly at our organization instead of focusing more on a project, and looking at our programming both in Zambia and Uganda, where we have amazing partner organizations, as well as the work that we do here in Canada across the country. So when it comes to localization and decolonization work within our organization and across our sector, I feel like there are so many barriers that we come up against. And Catherine and Talent spoke about them so eloquently, the restricted, very short-term funding built for very top-down approaches, and it can often seem hard or even impossible to do this work when we find ourselves trapped within these funding restrictive boxes. But what we've learned at Videa is that there's still so much that we can do within our organizations, and as Catherine said so well, redistribute that power at a grassroots organizational level. So I'm going to break this down a little bit and share some stories and examples and ideas about this as we go. So at Videa, we are we provide feminist, anti-oppressive, decolonized program leadership and direction using different knowledge systems and shared power to deliver programming that really challenges oppressive norms and shifts traditional power structures and gives leadership and voice to those who have been historically silenced and held back. So we encourage a feminist culture of kindness and inclusivity and connection where different knowledge systems are honored and where everyone exercises their voice and holds power in the delivery of our programs. We also deliver programs in an environment that encourages innovation and questioning of these oppressive norms and decolonized progressive management and opportunities for engagement and leadership within that. And we also have a strategic plan overview that's accompanied by a decolonization action plan. And these have goals that we've identified to progress Videa's responsibility in addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry final report with the 231 calls to justice. So I want to break this down more and talk about how we do this in practice, because most of the ways that we do this are really fun and easy and some things that everyone can do. So we can go to the next slide, please, John. So the biggest thing is we really work hard on developing long-term relationships with partners overseas and in Canada that are based on solidarity and friendship. And we consider overseas partners as equal partners in the development. And we have a very empowering relationship where we're working together and building a culture of community as we do this work. These are just a couple of pictures from on the right there. Those are some of my colleagues in Uganda who work for an organization called EWAD. And on the left, that's Lynn, their executive director. This was actually just the other day. I just stole it from our group chat in Zambia, working with some colleagues from Women for Change, which is an awesome grassroots organization based in Lusaka, Zambia. We also support the rights of Indigenous peoples, both here in Canada and abroad, control their own land and governance systems, and we're committed to collaborating and consulting Indigenous peoples in our work and working to have Indigenous peoples represented at all levels of our organization and supporting reconciliation activities. So one of the biggest ways, as I said, is relationships, and we really emphasize the importance of building relationships with organization that are rooted in the 4 R's. So that's respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and reconciliation. And we do this in a lot of different ways. You can go to the next slide, please. Really building community and relationships are at the heart of our work at Videa, both in person and in our virtual programming as well. So these are just a few examples. We have team meetings twice a week at Videa with staff in Zambia, Uganda, and here in Canada. That are not really focused on work. They're more focused on building those relationships and getting to know each other and knowing our different strengths or maybe weaknesses and being able to work really well together. We have a storytelling hour every week that was actually started during the pandemic and continues on today. That's that picture in the top left corner when we're celebrating one of our coworker Miranda's birthdays there. And this storytelling hour has been a really cool way to share knowledge and build solidarity across the communities that we work with. So we have folks join from across the communities that we work with who are sharing stories and knowledge and wisdom with everyone every evening once a week. So that's been really cool. We also celebrate and recognize holidays that hold up the cultures of team members. So based on annual consultations that we have. So we celebrate Zambian Independence Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. And one of the biggest things we do as well is integrate many ways of knowing and being Indigenous knowledge systems throughout our work. So we value all knowledge sets, which includes lived experiences and traditional Indigenous sets of knowledge. And we seek to diversify knowledge with all of our teams, including board and advisory capacities as well. And so this knowledge sharing and solidarity building with partners and with youth around the world is really key to the work that we do as well. A good example of this is our International Youth Conference, which you can see in the bottom right corner there. We had over 2,200 youth from across Uganda, Zambia, and Canada join the line. This was last fall, and it was a really cool conference with youth. If you look closely, it's kind of small, but you can see it was a hybrid model. So we had classrooms in Zambia, in Uganda, join the line there with youth in Canada. And it was all focused on sharing knowledge, and we had speakers and facilitators from all 3 countries. We also had a highlight of that conference was the elders panel, which is in the bottom left there. And again, it was really a way to build solidarity across the work that we do and share those different sets of knowledge. So those are elders on the line there from Canada and Zambia and Uganda for a very cool event that we had there. We also define experience and qualifications in different ways at FIDEA. And, we acknowledge that there's the hegemony of Western knowledge system has been used to gatekeep social justice and international development sectors. So what this looks like is trying to have more accessible job recruitments and job postings, and looking to, again, just value all sets of knowledge and not just, university degrees or Western ideas of what knowledge is. So these are just a few examples. In the top right corner there, that's our climate team. Our climate team is made up of Indigenous youth leaders from Canada and Zambia who are working together to engage their communities in climate resilience and climate justice. And again, we share different teachings and knowledge on how to do this across the board there. The last thing for this section I wanted to talk about was finance. So we talked a lot about it already in Catherine and Talent's presentations, that there are a lot of colonial barriers and funding parameters when it comes to the work that we do that can often, be a barrier in doing the awesome localization and decolonization work that's happening on the ground. And so what I find often happens is we have this really cool work going on, and it has to fit within these funding boxes, and they just kind of hit together. And so it's finding ways to redistribute that power and work within those boxes in ways that still put the power within the hands of those who are taking part in the project. So an example of what we do for this is putting the budgets in the hands of the community and the community project leaders to manage. So we have a lot of budget management training, and the budgets are held in the community. So they are the ones who are managing it and looking at how things should be spent. So we go to the next slide. So all of these have had a huge impact on the communities and folks that we work with. We're really walking together side by side, and our voices of those we're working with are being represented and heard and elevated and a part of the decision making. They're a part of the conversation and really leading the change in the programming that we do. And as an organization, we've really grown exponentially since we've started making these changes and doing this process within our organization. So we have grown a lot in the number of staff we have, and in the funding that we receive, and in the programming that we do since we embarked on this journey. There are lots of projects I could have taken as a quick example here, but I'm biased and wanted to talk quickly about one of the ones that I've been coordinating this year. So this is a project through Canada Service Corps. So it's actually up north in Nunavut. It's a community called Coral Harbour, which is on an island in the Hudson's Bay. And the Canada Service Corps project is made up of 15 different projects across Canada here, and they're looking at engaging their communities in climate resilience and climate justice. And so what this group has done is we partnered with a really cool set of youth and community leaders in Coral Harbour. And we said, well, what do you want to do in your community? What are the needs of your community when it comes to the environment, and when it comes to just what needs to be done in your community where there's a gap? And so what they did was they took the project and the budget and decided to create these waste management system within their community. And so this is just an example of how we worked very closely with our partner organization and the youth that were there, and they were the ones leading this project and deciding what was to be done within this project here. Can go to the next slide. So I also want to talk a little bit about what kind of work we've done on this within governance systems in our own organization. So this is our organization chart. It's very colorful and fun. But it's one of the things we did when we first started was we looked at our org chart and realized it's quite hierarchical and very top down, you know, with executive director on top and kind of moving down. So we intentionally wanted to change that and look at how we could reflect the work we do at Videa, because it's really, as I've talked about, we're all working together and everyone holds power and decision making within the organization. So this was a way of doing it. This is, as you can see, it's kind of like an ecosystem, and you have all the program support teams. So, you know, executive director and different operations managers at the bottom there, kind of in the roots supporting the rest of the team. So very kind of bottom up visually, as you see, and it's kind of looking at it like an ecosystem. So we have all of our different teams at Videa, our climate team and our gender team, which does a lot of cool work, and our overseas teams within the chart there. So we can go to the next slide. Another thing we've done is we've looked at all of our policies, and we've done a lot of updates to our policies, looked at what kind of barriers are within there, how is it maybe not accessible language, and changed that. And we also have a document we put together just about all of this work that we've been doing in this process. And then we also have our decolonization toolkit. So this is kind of the last thing that I wanted to talk about. Something that's really important to us at Videa is advocating for localization and decolonization and reconciliation within our sector. So we facilitated many workshops with others to share the knowledge that we've been learning and continue to keep learning. We've had workshops in person and virtual with Operation Canada and other organizations, classrooms and libraries. And we have this toolkit that we have put together over the past few years. The toolkit is designed to spark conversation and growth, both personally and professionally and at an organization level or even community-wide. And it can be used fully or in pieces depending on what works best for whoever is using it. There's also a facilitator guide there. I can put the link in the chat here to access this. It's a free resource that we have. Oops, put it in the chat quickly. There we go. And it's been a really cool tool that other organizations have been able to use, as well as us to go back to and look at our goals for this as well. So yeah, that was just, I didn't have much time, so I just wanted to do a big overview of some of the things that we've been doing at Videa, and, you know, knowing that there's a lot of work to be done at a systemic level to be able to have this localization and decolonization that everyone's been talking about today. But there are little things that can be done just at a smaller level to start doing this work and start having these conversations to be able to redistribute that power and leave no one behind and work together to create change. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. These were all amazing presentation, and even though they were quite different, speaking up from different perspective, it was we could see definitely common themes being discussed by each of our speaker. We have about like 15 minutes for a discussion, so I will now invite you all to share your question either in the chat or you can raise your hand. You can direct your question to one speaker, or this could be for all of them. It could be in French, it could be either in French or in English, as we have the interpretation.
Hi, can I ask a question? My name is Elmer Lighid from World Vision Canada.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I think all the presenters talk about partnering with local organizations as one of the key elements in decolonization or localization. Can you please explore any one of your, or maybe Catherine, I think she spoke a little bit more about this. Can you speak a little more about, what is the ideal type of partnership? Because there could be different levels, or the partnership could evolve from just, its tokenism to really like more of a collaboration, equal partners and all that. Yeah, can you elaborate more on that, Catherine, please?
Sure. So the way I've interpreted your question is how did localization of the partnership work out between between us and Albinism Royal Foundation? I think
Yes.
this was the key foundation for maybe my partnership with Albinism Royal Foundation was the personal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think, when you spend time in a country, you build relationship. And I think me spending time in Sierra Leone helped me build relationship with communities. Because often when we work in global development, we tend to hot desk, right? We go to different countries. The funding is, dictating where the grant is going to go, which country in the OECD. And so then we pivot according to where the funding, again, this speaks to the system and structural level changes. For me, I know that I spent a lot of time in Sierra Leone, so that became my second home. And that means I invest in the second home. And I think that's what was maybe foundational to my partnership with Albinism Royal Foundation.
Thanks, Catherine. For the other two presenters, if you can maybe speak about, organizational relation at the organizational level, like how would that look like ideally if we talk about localization?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Catherine said. I think something I could maybe add is when it comes to having different funding periods that have a start date and end date, having a relationship that goes beyond the end date of those periods. So instead of having like say a 1-year project and you're working very closely building relationship with the people you're working with, and then it ends and then you just stop talking to them, and then maybe you get more funding and then you bring those conversations back. That's not really sustainable and conducive to good localization. It's just, as Catherine said, the importance of building those relationships and knowing them personally and making sure that they're sustainable. So you're maintaining those relationships, even if there's thousands of kilometers between you, still having those conversations, even when there's maybe no funding to do work. I think that's really, really important.
Thank you, Helmer, for your question. I think Talent left the conversation. She might come back. I think at the beginning she had some connectivity issues. So while we wait to see if she is able to join again, maybe I will invite a participant to share another question. John? I see that John Hagen, you unmute yourself. Is it because you have a question for our speakers? Okay, Haley Thompson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this session and these wonderful presentations. Unfortunately, I had to miss a little bit of Catherine's presentation because there was a loose dog in the neighborhood. So my apologies if this has already been addressed, but I was wondering if the speakers, this session is focused on small and medium organizations and how they can do this work. But I was wondering if you could share any recommendation for larger organizations, given that Canada does still move a lot of its funding through large Canadian organizations. Would you have key recommendations, a takeaway, a push, a challenge that you'd like to issue towards your colleagues in larger organizations?
Oh, you go ahead, Catherine.
No, you go ahead.
I can start. That's such a good question. I feel like, I mean, my first thought was just that grants and contributions transformation initiative is happening and how exciting that is, because I'm really hoping that that will have a big impact on all organizations, whether they're small, medium, or those larger organizations. And I'm hoping that yeah, that will have an impact. But I mean, in terms of what we can do and like key things that I would push, I think I just go back to what we do at Videa, which is push that agenda of decolonization and localization. And I know we've done some workshops with bigger organizations, and it's been really, really cool and eye-opening to do that work. But I find when it comes to larger organizations, they're less willing to change and less willing to embark on a process of transformation because they're really big and they've been doing this work for so long. So I think something that I would really push is just to really encourage them to look at what they can do to make those changes and to change the way they do things and change the spaces that they work in, even if it seems kind of, you know, why would we do that? We've been doing things this way the whole time. I'd really push them to look critically at the work that they do and what barriers are there for the communities that they work with, and how embarking on a process of localization, decolonization can address those barriers in a way that all organizations, whatever size you are, could do.
I was going to add, like, I don't have much experience working with larger, organization, but what I can maybe speak to as an outsider or an external person is sometimes we have a lot of barriers because we go, well, the system doesn't support it or the structure doesn't support it. But I think larger organization can be creative in eliminating these barriers. And when I say creative means if you do get a large chunk of funding, how can you maybe slice that pie that would also invite other sort of, small, medium organization or even grassroots organization to participate in that bigger picture or the bigger objective? How can we collectively come? And I think this will probably require a more courageous move and perhaps more support from the funding body. So yeah, like I would say being creative and not letting those barriers almost numb our thinking.
Thank you, Haley, for the question. And thanks, Lily and Catherine. And thanks, Michael. I see that you shared in the chat some recommendations coming from Talon's presentation. Any other question? While we wait for another question, maybe I will just ask that one of the things that we observe in our study on small and medium-sized organization, the point that you mentioned, Catherine, around personal relationship was a very important turning point, which distinguished the large organization from the small and medium one, since a lot of the SMOs that we interviewed mentioned that the reason why they are still involved in the sector is because of those personal relationships that they made over time. Sometimes it's organization that has been funded by the same person and that still worked there 2 decades ago, and this is based on that personal relationship that they build as a volunteers, for example, or an intern. And when we looked at the localization and the capacity to pivot and integrate localization approaches, we would see that the very small microorganization had a limited capacity to participate in those discussions around localization and do these important shifts that are required, while the medium-sized organization had a little bit more space and capacity to do it, while the larger were a little bit stuck because of their size and the capacity to adapt and to change. So this is really aligned with what we've learned from our study. So since I don't see any other question. Oh, go ahead, Rosemary. Would you like to speak? Otherwise, I can read your comment. A simple suggestion might be to share the Global Affairs Canada overhead contribution between partners in order to help build up local reserves or allow local flexibility in programming. Thanks, Rosemary, for sharing. Okay, so I would like to thank our speaker and thank you all for participating in this session. This was fantastic to hear from each of you. And as I said at the beginning, it's great to see such important impact from this SMO initiative and from small investment. I would also like to thank our interpreters. So thank you so much, Danielle and Jean. Thanks for the Spirit Change team as well for putting this session together and organizing everything. I would also like to invite you all to our next session as part of the SMO speaker series, which will be on scaling and organizational growth. So Lily touched a little bit about a growing organization and some of the challenges and some of the opportunity. So this is what will be discussed at our next session, which will be at the end of November. So if you're not already following our newsletter, receiving our newsletter, you can register to receive our newsletter in either English or French, and we will share the registration and all the details about this next event in the coming weeks. And thank you all for joining today and for sharing. The recording will be made available on Spirit Change page and within our newsletter in the coming weeks as well.